Welcome to the Shawshank Redemption Brokedown Palace narrated PowerPoint presentation. This assignment will be comparing 5 different movie characters across 2 different movies and applying them to the Pains of Imprisonment from Shamus 2017 along with the Hanser 2020 textbook chapters. The relevance of this assignment is to essentially establish relationships between the Pains of Imprisonment and the Hanser chapters as well as the movies. Essentially, I will be starting with Red, Warden Norton, followed by Warden Norton, then Captain Headley, then Alice, and then Darlene Davis. The first character I will be looking at is Red from Shawshank Redemption. The pain of imprisonment that I have chosen for him comes from Shamus' 2017 article, Definition of Heterosexual Relationship. It is essentially where it tells how heterosexual relations are a profound loss for inmates. It is essentially how homosexual relations then become an outlet for inmates seeking that heterosexual relationship release. The first Shawshank example that best applies to this comes from Darbot 1994, 26 minutes, 24 seconds. This is where Red introduces the sisters to Andy and describes how essentially they use homosexuality as kind of an outlet. It's implied that they use the outlet as an outlet from Red. Red doesn't necessarily say it. The Hanser 2020 text chapter that best relates to this is chapter 9, where it talks about punks, specifically on Hanser 2020, page 234. Punks are inmates that are picked out to be treated as women for the sexual pleasures of other inmates. The sisters embody the position of the inmates who choose other inmates to be punks. Essentially, it can be reasonably assumed that Red may have been punked or had done the punking at some point at his time during prison. The second Shawshank example comes from Darbot 1994, 1 hour, 15 minutes, 38 seconds. This is where Red is sitting in a cell. There is a picture of a woman behind him. It can be reasonably assumed that this woman is a representative of his lack of heterosexual relationships. This is due to and the Hanser 2020 text that best correlates with this is chapter 12. Hanser 2020, page 335 on chapter 12 talks about the HIV and its presence in inmate populations. Though Red was in prison before the HIV epidemic, there is still other sexually transmitted diseases, and he would have had a higher risk factor in participating in those relationships and that behavior. Thus, I believe it would be reasonable to assume that he may have had that picture there to help alleviate his heterosexual urges in some way. The second character I will be talking about will be from Shawshank Redemption, that is Warden Norton. The Shamus 2017 pain of imprisonment that I will be applying will be the deprivation of autonomy. This can be found on Shamus 2017, page 4. It describes the deprivation of prisoners' ability to essentially even make the basic decisions in their life. The Shawshank example that best fits this comes from Darnbolt 1994, 13 minutes, 9 seconds. This essentially shows Warden Norton outlaying the rules to the inmates, him and his staff both outlaying the rules to the inmates. Very strict regiment that the inmates must follow. The Hanser 2020 text that best applies to this comes from chapter 14, Hanser 2020, page 394, where Hanser describes 2 styles of prison management. One is proactive, the other is authoritative. I believe Warden Norton demonstrates the authoritative based on his strict rules, strict policies that limit the autonomy of the inmates. The second Shawshank example comes from Darnbolt 1994, 32 minutes, 59 seconds. This is where essentially the warden is given out a special assignment to prisoners to resurface the roof on top of the prison. This essentially is giving them a small amount of freedom, giving them a small amount of their autonomy back through the resurfacing of the roof. The Hanser chapter that best applies to this is from the Hanser 2020 text is chapter 15, from Hanser 2020, page 424, where Hanser talks about there being 2 different kinds of work. One type of work that benefits the prison and one type of work meant to teach the prisoners a skill. Essentially, Warden Norton is using is waxing his control on their autonomy to essentially allow the inmates to do a particular amount of work to benefit both the prison and for them to learn the new skill of resurfacing a roof. The third character I will be looking at comes from Shawshank Redemption, be Captain Hadley. The Shamas 2017 article that best applies to him will be the deprivation of security found on Shamas 2017, page 4. It essentially says that prisons can be unsafe places that serve as hotbeds for crime. Essentially, it states that prisoners are subject to crime within the prisons, mostly from other inmates, specifically rape. The first Shawshank example I have, that comes from Darnbolt, 1994, 44 minutes, 44 seconds. This is essentially where Captain Headley beats up the leader of the sisters, whose name is Boggs. Hadley is essentially committing a crime when he's assaulting Boggs, and the Hanser 2020 text chapter that best relates to this is chapter 7, found on Hanser 2020, page 188, where it talks about blind spots in the prison. Boggs' cell is a blind spot within that prison, thus Hadley is able to get away with what he did. The second Shawshank example comes from Darnbolt, 1994, 1 hour, 37 minutes, 48 seconds. This essentially shows Hadley shooting and killing Tommy Williams, thus depriving him of his life and his security, and thus committing a crime against him. So then the Hanser 2020 text, chapter 3, best relates to the second Shawshank example that I showed before, where Hadley kills Tommy. Again, it's Hanser 2020, page 60, describes the delicate balance between maintaining inmate rights and providing security. Hadley essentially disregarded Tommy's rights, and he essentially killed him without any cause to do so. Tommy was not threatening to escape, nor was he threatening the warden in any way. The fourth character I will be looking at is Alice Morano, the pain of imprisonment, Shamas 2017 article, where the pain of imprisonment that best applies to her is deprivation of liberty, found on Shamas 2017, page 2. This essentially tells how the fundamental premise behind prisons is to remove or to restrict liberty. This can be best shown in Brokedown Palace example 1, from Kaplan, 1999, 27 minutes, 38 seconds, where essentially Alice is being brought to the women's prison, thus being denied her liberty. The best Hanser 2020 text chapter is chapter 1, that applies to the first Brokedown Palace, where again Alice is being brought to the prison. This applies specifically in Hanser 2020, page 4, where Hanser defines that corrections is a process whereby practitioners from a variety of agencies and programs use tools and techniques and facilities to engage in organized security. In this case, the government is using the prison, which is a facility, to essentially engage in the deprivation of liberty of Alice. The second Brokedown Palace example comes from Kaplan, 1999, 38 seconds, Kaplan, 1999, 38 minutes, 24 seconds, and this essentially shows where Alice is being sentenced for 33 years by the court. The Hanser 2020 chapter that best correlates with this is chapter 6, Hanser 2020, on page 146. It essentially talks about immediate sanctions and how prison sentences are meant to essentially rehabilitate. The court in the second Brokedown Palace example essentially would have had to believe that Alice would have been rehabilitated, because within that clip it also alludes to how she could have gotten life. Instead, the court believed that she could be rehabilitated with those 33 years. And thus, ultimately, her liberty will be taken away for those 33 years as she is being rehabilitated. The final character I will be looking at will be Darlene Davis from the Brokedown Palace. The 2017 Shamas 2017 pain imprisonment article. The pain imprisonment that best applies to her will be deprivation of goods and services, found on Shamas 2017, page 2, which is essentially describes what a deprivation of a good or service is essentially a good or service that cannot be found in prison, versus if you were outside prison. The Brokedown Palace example of this comes from Kaplan, 1999, 30 minutes, 3 seconds. This is essentially where Darlene is being deprived of fruit by the guard. If she were outside prison, she would have been able to enjoy any fruit that she wanted to. The Hanser 2020 text that best correlates with this will be from chapter 2. So chapter 2 best correlates with the Brokedown Palace example 1. Specifically on Hanser 2020, page 38, describes sanctions as being as punishments, whereas in this particular example of Brokedown Palace example 1, one of the sanctions is, or punishments would be, the deprivation of fruit, in which case is one of the goods that is being deprived. Second Brokedown Palace example comes from Kaplan 1999, 1 hour, 10 minutes and 6 seconds. This is essentially where Alice faints due to an ear infection caused by a cockroach. The Hanser 2020 text that best correlates with this comes from chapter 4, specifically on Hanser 2020, page 103. Essentially describes the standards of medical care within the prison and how they are much less and subpar than that of outside the prison. Essentially, if Alice would have had medical care outside the prison, she would have caught the infection way before her fainting, or having to faint within the prison. Thus, she was deprived of the service of the medical attention.